Imagine a man with unimaginable wealth, a palace lined with gold, a monumental temple that gleamed under the sun, and a harem of 1,000 women from different kingdoms, all seeking his attention. Sounds like a story from legend, but this was the reality of King Solomon, the wisest ruler of all time, who led Israel during its golden age. But here's what no one tells you. Ruling an empire is already a challenge, but managing 1,000 wives and concubines while trying to maintain order, faith, and power is something beyond comprehension. So how did he do it? The truth is, behind all the splendor and prosperity, there was a world of political deals, power struggles, and hidden tensions. Solomon's temple, with its towering columns and walls covered in pure gold, wasn't just a place of worship, it was a declaration of dominance. But while Levites chanted hymns and priests performed sacred sacrifices, inside the palace walls, unseen battles were being fought. Each wife had her own origins, ambitions, and strategies. Some were there to secure alliances, others to influence royal policies, and all of them wanted to be noticed by the most powerful man in the world. And Solomon? He had to keep the balance between devotion, diplomacy, and desire. But was it really possible? The man who built the grandest temple ever seen also allowed foreign beliefs to take root in his palace, shaping his decisions in unexpected ways. Slowly, a reign of wisdom and stability began to crack under the weight of indulgence and ambition. How could a king so gifted by God make choices that would ultimately doom not only his legacy, but the fate of an entire nation? What truly happened inside the sacred walls of Solomon's temple and behind the locked doors of his harem remains one of the greatest mysteries of biblical history. And today, you're about to uncover the details few ever speak about. Get ready, because what you're about to learn will change the way you see this era of the Bible forever. Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all affection to build your life. Together, we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. If you had a time machine and could visit Jerusalem at the height of Solomon's reign, your eyes would hardly believe what they saw. Solomon's temple was a true golden jewel in the heart of the city, a monument that gleamed in the sunlight as if made from heaven's own gold. Built with Lebanese cedar wood and perfectly carved stones, it left every visitor in awe. The power and wealth of Solomon were evident in every detail, from the gold-covered walls to the towering cherubim sculptures, a masterpiece that took 7 years and 180,000 men to complete. But what would drive a king to invest so much in a single construction? To Solomon, this wasn't just a building, it was the symbol of God's covenant, tangible proof that Israel was a chosen nation. Solomon's harem and royal court had a direct connection to this grandeur. The temple corridors witnessed not only prayers and sacrifices, but also the footsteps of royal wives who brought influences and traditions from distant lands. Each woman had a strategic relationship with Solomon. Some were key political alliances, others represented sealed pacts between nations. But what few realize is that the temple, beyond being a place of worship, was also a center of power and strategy. And don't think the temple's interior was any less impressive than its exterior. As visitors entered, they encountered a gold-encrusted hall adorned with rare stones. The sacred rituals took place under the flickering light of golden lamps, illuminating the details of the monumental columns and the cherubim sculptures that seemed to watch over everything. The reflection of gold on the walls created a mystical atmosphere. Some accounts say that the priests and Levites, walking on the decorated floor, felt as if they were literally stepping into a piece of heaven. But of course, this level of extreme wealth came at a tremendous cost. Maintaining the temple, the harem, and the royal court required heavy taxation on the people. To a simple farmer struggling to secure his harvest, it was difficult to understand why so much gold was needed to honor God. Over time, this relentless taxation planted the first seeds of public dissatisfaction, a crucial factor in the eventual decline of the kingdom. The temple wasn't just a place of devotion, it also hosted secret rituals, many of which were influenced by Solomon's foreign wives. Some traditions came from Egypt, others from Phoenicia, others from Mesopotamia. It's said that hidden ceremonies took place within its walls, practices that sparked curiosity but also fear. To what extent did these influences shape Solomon's decisions? That question echoes across centuries. And among all this, there was one sacred space where no ordinary man could set foot, the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest was permitted to enter, and even then, only once a year. Inside rested the Ark of the Covenant, the ultimate symbol of God's presence among the Israelites. In its presence, even the most powerful king became small. To Solomon, the temple was the direct link between heaven and earth, but did he himself truly respect that sacred connection? As the years passed, the temple's magnificence and its overwhelming wealth began raising concerns. Was this truly a divine legacy, or had it become a sign of excess and arrogance? The people started wondering, was Solomon still following God's ways, or was he being consumed by the allure of gold and the fascination of power? These doubts only grew stronger, especially when the king's harem began to exert an unexpected influence on his decisions. Imagine a palace where 1,000 women compete, not only for the king's attention, but also for power and influence over one of the most prosperous kingdoms in history. This was Solomon's harem, a labyrinth of political alliances, hidden strategies, and refined beauty. Among his 700 royal wives and 300 concubines, each brought their own customs, religions, and interests from their homelands. This harem was far more than a place of luxury and pleasure. It was a silent battlefield where persuasion and intrigue mattered more than brute force. But don't think life in the harem was easy. There was a strict daily ritual of purification and beauty, from baths in rare oils and perfumes imported from Arabia to the use of exquisite linen garments embroidered with precious stones. Every detail was meticulously planned. Women spent hours being prepared before appearing before the king, knowing that a single flaw could mean the difference between being noticed or forgotten. It wasn't just about beauty. It was a game of strategy where every move mattered. And as with any place filled with wealth and power, conflicts were inevitable. Within the harem, hidden rivalries unfolded daily. There were the favorites who had direct access to the king, and others who went months or even years without being summoned. Some wives, particularly those of Egyptian or Phoenician origin, sought strategic alliances, ensuring privileges for their sons and, perhaps, a chance to place one of them on the throne. A misinterpreted glance, a poorly timed word, and a woman could be cast aside forever. For them, this game was a matter of survival. At the center of this dynamic stood the pharaoh's daughter, who held a privileged position within the harem. Her marriage to Solomon was not a mere act of love. It was a high-level political agreement, securing peace between Egypt and Israel. As the wife of a king who valued strategic alliances, she knew her role extended far beyond simply sharing the royal bed. Within the palace walls, her presence ensured political influence and access to valuable information circulating through the corridors of power. Behind the silk curtains and perfumed incense, secret rituals took place. Many of these women brought their own spiritual traditions, some of which began to influence Solomon himself. Small altars started appearing discreetly within the palace. Walls dedicated to foreign gods and practices previously unknown in Israel became increasingly common. The blending of beliefs began to intensify, and the king, who had once been steadfast in his devotion to the God of Israel, slowly found himself immersed in a spiritual landscape far different from his ancestors' traditions. The harem was not only a place of beauty and intrigue, but also a center of decision-making. Some wives advised the king, others provided valuable intelligence on foreign kingdoms, and some merely waited for the right moment to influence a decree or even a war. Solomon, as wise as he was not immune to the subtle manipulations of this game. He may have ruled Israel with a magical ring that granted him power, but within the palace it was whispered words and strategic gazes that truly shaped the kingdom's fate. And while the palace halls were filled with plots and rivalries, outside, the people began to feel the weight of the king's decisions. Every new alliance meant more taxes, more constructions, more expenses. How long could the kingdom sustain this pace? The answer would come in the following years, as the consequences of excess started to manifest. As the sun rose over Jerusalem, a new day began within the Temple of Solomon, and the activity inside started early. Before the city fully awakened, the priests were already preparing for the sacred rituals. The first sound that echoed through the golden halls was the melody of harps and flutes, marking the start of the morning ceremonies. The temple was not just a physical space, it was a living stage where every detail had a purpose, from the incense-filled corridors to the golden glow reflecting the first rays of sunlight. The day began with a carefully orchestrated choreography, where every movement, every sound, and every sacrifice pointed toward a single goal: the pursuit of divine presence. In the outer courtyard, a group of Levites arranged the offerings. The scent of burning incense blended with the aroma of spices and sacrificial meat roasting on the altar, while the priests carried out the rituals with near-surgical precision. Every lamb offered had to be flawless, without blemish, perfect. In every way, the purpose was clear: to ensure that the covenant with God was renewed each morning. As the offerings were made, the people gathered on the temple steps, watching with reverence and fear as each part of the ceremony unfolded, shaping their faith and identity. But sacrifices were not the only defining aspect of temple life. Within its walls, there was also a space dedicated to wisdom and teaching. Scholars of the law sat beneath towering columns, discussing the scriptures with eager disciples. This was where the stories of the patriarchs, the deeds of David, and the divine promises to Israel were passed down from generation to generation. Learning inside the temple was deep and transformative. It was not just about memorizing words. It was about embracing a way of life, and at the very heart of this magnificent sanctuary lay a place few dared even to imagine entering: the Holy of Holies. Hidden behind a thick veil, it was where the Ark of the Covenant rested, the ultimate representation of God's presence on earth. Only the high priest was permitted to enter, and even then, only once a year on the Day of Atonement. Some believed that if the priest was not spiritually pure, he could die instantly upon entering. Because of this, tradition says that a bell was tied to his ankle. If the sound stopped, those outside would know something had gone wrong. For the Israelites, this was the physical manifestation of the divine, proof that God still dwelled among them. Meanwhile, inside Solomon's royal palace, another scene was playing out. The connection between the temple and the king's harem was not just spiritual, but also political. Some of Solomon's wives observed the temple rituals from afar, curious about the deep devotion of Israel's priests and people. Others sought to understand its influence over the nation. For some of them, the temple's grandeur was beyond comprehension. After all, they came from lands with their own gods, traditions, and spiritual practices. But for Solomon, the temple was the central pillar of his legacy. He knew that every stone of that building carried not only gold, but also power and history. And so day after day, the temple pulsed as the spiritual heart of Israel. Through sacrifices, hymns, and teachings, the city moved around it. But over time, something began to change. The golden shine of the temple was no longer enough to silence the unrest growing among the people. The wealth, once seen as a sign of divine blessing, now sparked concerns. Taxes were rising, the royal treasury was emptying, and whispers of discontent echoed through the streets. The temple's splendor still impressed many, but how long would the people tolerate paying the price to maintain it? At the very heart of Solomon's temple, hidden behind a thick sacred veil, there was a place where few dared even to imagine stepping foot, the Holy of Holies. This was not just another chamber within the temple, it was the very intersection between the divine and the earthly, the place where the Ark of the Covenant rested, sealing God's covenant with Israel. Only the high priest could enter that sacred space, and even then only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. It was said that if he was not spiritually pure, he would die upon entry. That is why, according to tradition, a bell was tied to his ankle. If the sound ceased, it meant that something had gone terribly wrong. This was a place not meant for human habitation. The walls were covered in pure gold, reflecting the sacred flames of the temple lamps. Two massive cherubim carved from olive wood stood over the ark, their wings outstretched, symbolizing divine guardianship. For the Israelites, the Holy of Holies was the assurance that God's presence remained with them, that the covenant made in Moses' time was still alive. But this divine presence demanded absolute reverence. There were no luxuries, only the essence of faith in its purest form. The Holy of Holies was so important to Israel's identity that many believed the security of the entire kingdom depended on its preservation. If the temple were ever destroyed, what would become of the people? This question weighed heavily on the minds of Israel's elders, but while the priests continued their sacred duties, upholding the sanctity of the temple, something unsettling was happening inside Solomon's harem. Among his 700 wives and 300 concubines, there were women from foreign lands, daughters of kings and priests of other nations. Some of them, raised in entirely different spiritual traditions, observed the Holy of Holies with deep fascination. But their curiosity did not stop at observation. Some began introducing their own religious practices into the kingdom. Small altars began appearing within the palace walls, dedicated to foreign deities. This was a turning point in Solomon's reign. The influence of his harem over his decisions grew quietly but significantly. Phoenician wives brought worship of Ashtoreth, the Moabites revered Chemosh, and even Egyptian priests found their way into the court. Solomon, once unshakable in his faith, now found himself surrounded by a spiritual world far removed from the traditions of his ancestors. Slowly, a troubling question began to circulate among the most devout. Was Solomon's heart still fully devoted to God? The temple still stood, the rituals still continued, but foreign influences were creeping into the kingdom. The Holy of Holies remained sacred, untouched, but for how much longer? Outside the palace walls, the people began to notice the shifts in their society. Small murmurs of discontent arose among the elders and spiritual leaders. The wisest king in history was facing a dilemma. Would he remain faithful to God's covenant, or would he succumb to the influence of his foreign wives and the pressures of the surrounding nations? The answer to that question would shape the future of Israel for generations to come. I will now continue translating the remaining sections of your script with full accuracy, depth, and engagement, preserving the natural flow of the original text. Stay tuned for the next part. At the center of Solomon's vast kingdom, where the Temple of Gold stood as a symbol of his covenant with God, there was another domain, one less sacred but just as powerful, the royal harem. To many, this was simply a place of luxury and pleasure, where 1,000 women lived surrounded by fragrant oils, fine silks, and beauty rituals. But to those who truly understood the game of power, the harem was much more than a refuge for the king. It was a silent battlefield where alliances were forged, strategies were enacted, and the future of Israel was shaped behind closed doors. Each woman in the harem had her own story and political agenda. They were not there merely for love or companionship. They were valuable political pieces. Solomon's marriages with foreign princesses were not acts of romance, but of diplomacy, way to secure peace between powerful nations. The pharaoh's daughter, for instance, was not just another wife. She was a direct link between Israel and Egypt, the most dominant empire of the time. Her position in the harem was unique because her presence symbolized a strategic alliance that benefited both nations. And if you think these women simply waited passively for their turn to see the king, you're mistaken. They were mentors, advisors, and hidden diplomats. Some had direct access to Solomon, engaging in private conversations that shaped his decisions. Others used their intelligence and charm to stay relevant in court, forming internal alliances to protect their interests. The struggle for attention and influence was not just about emotions, it was about survival. And as expected in any place filled with power, wealth, and ambition, conflicts were inevitable. Wives from rival kingdoms carried centuries-old grudges, and some refused to share their space with women from lands they once considered enemies. The harem became an arena of subtle manipulations, where every glance, every word, and every favor had consequences. Small personal rivalries could escalate into major political tensions, affecting not just the harem, but also the governance of the entire kingdom. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this influence was the introduction of foreign beliefs and rituals into Israel. Many of Solomon's wives worshipped deities other than the God of Israel, and over time they began to introduce their religious customs into the palace. Shrines were discreetly erected, private ceremonies were held, and soon, what once seemed like harmless traditions began altering the spiritual structure of the kingdom, and the people noticed. Whispers of discontent grew louder. How could the king, who built the greatest temple for the God of Israel, now allow foreign gods to be worshipped within his own household? Was the wisest ruler in history losing his focus? The political influence of the harem was no longer a secret. It was shaping Solomon's policies, his faith, and even his legacy. Solomon still held absolute power, but for how long? Could he continue balancing the weight of gold, the desires of his wives, and the faith of his ancestors? Or would the very elements that made him strong become the source of his downfall? The answer would soon become evident as internal conflicts began to spiral out of control. Within the walls of Solomon's harem, where 1,000 women fought for dominance, there was more than just luxury and pleasure. There were also power struggles, jealousy, and silent battles. In a world where some wives had direct access to the king while others were forgotten, tensions were inevitable. The fight for power within the palace was a subtle art, where every woman used her intelligence, her connections, and even her heritage to secure her place. Some stood out because of their wisdom, others for their charm, and others for their royal lineage. But they all knew that one mistake could banish them into obscurity forever, and the conflicts weren't just among the wives. Solomon himself, surrounded by so many different influences, began to feel pressured by difficult decisions. He needed to balance his faith in God with the religious customs of his foreign wives, manage political alliances without angering Israel's religious leaders, and keep the peace within his own palace. But as he started permitting small shrines and temples for other gods, the priests of Solomon's temple began to see this as a betrayal. How could a king so wise allow such corruption in the faith he was meant to protect? The tension inside the palace spread into the streets of Jerusalem. The people, who once saw Solomon as a divinely inspired leader, began to question his judgment. The heavy taxation to sustain the luxuries of the palace, the grandeur of the temple, and the growing influence of foreign customs left many disillusioned. The elders of Israel reminisced about the reign of David, a warrior king devoted solely to God, and asked, what happened to his son? How did a king blessed with unmatched wisdom allow himself to be swayed by wealth and desire? Inside the harem, the power struggles were not just about gaining the king's affection, they were about securing political dominance. Some wives worked to ensure advantages for their sons, forming alliances with influential figures to position their children as potential heirs to the throne. Others, realizing the king's increasing indecision, manipulated him into making political and religious compromises. Every dinner, every private conversation, every whispered word carried hidden motives and deep consequences, and as the harem battled for control, the temple itself began to fracture. Solomon's devotion, once unquestionable, was now seen with suspicion by the priests. While the Ark of the Covenant remained in the Holy of Holies, outside, foreign altars were rising, and what was once a pure and devoted faith was now splitting into multiple influences. The people could see it happening. The rumors that Solomon was falling under the influence of his wives spread fast, and trust in his leadership began to wane. The king, who had built an unshakable empire, was now struggling to keep it together. He still held great riches, unmatched wisdom, and a harem that symbolized diplomatic dominance. But could he maintain the balance between faith, power, and politics, or had the forces he once controlled begun to unravel his kingdom from within? The cracks in his rule were becoming clearer each day. Within the golden corridors of Solomon's temple, Israel's faith was displayed in all its splendor. The sacrifices, the Levite choirs, and the sacred presence of the Holy of Holies were testaments to the people's devotion to the God of Israel. But behind the palace walls, within Solomon's harem, a different reality was unfolding. As foreign wives gained influence over the king, their customs and rituals began to seep into the kingdom. Small private altars were erected in secret, and what started as mere cultural exchanges soon became a transformation of Israel's religious landscape. The gold still shone in the temple, but other gods were beginning to receive worship within. Solomon's very own palace, the once steadfast king began making small compromises. The Phoenician wives worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of fertility and war. The Moabites paid homage to Chemosh, and the Ammonites revered Moloch, a god infamous for demanding human sacrifices. At first, Solomon merely allowed his wives to practice their beliefs in private, but over time he went further. He built temples for these deities, allowing foreign rituals to flourish in the land of Israel. The same hands that built the temple of God were now raising altars to gods of other nations. The priests of the Temple of Solomon began to take notice. The spiritual foundation of Israel was being compromised, and murmurs of discontent arose. The people, already burdened by heavy taxation to support the royal court, now felt an even deeper betrayal. What would happen to Israel if its king no longer remained loyal to the God of their ancestors? History had already proven that whenever the people of Israel turned away from God, disaster soon followed. But this wasn't just about faith, it was about power. The secret rituals performed by Solomon's wives often included mysterious ceremonies held in the dead of night. Fires burned in hidden courtyards, and chants in unknown languages echoed through the palace walls. Rumors began to circulate that Solomon himself had taken part in some of these rituals, seeking answers beyond human understanding. He still wore the ring that granted him authority, but was it protecting him, or had it become his downfall? This was the turning point in Solomon's reign. What had started as a few small shrines hidden in the palace soon escalated into widespread religious changes throughout Israel. Jerusalem, once the spiritual heart of monotheism, now had temples dedicated to multiple gods. The Holy of Holies remained untouched, but the purity of Israel's faith was fading, and as faith was being tested, political tensions escalated. Solomon, the once unshakable ruler, was no longer fully in control. The people sensed the shift, and dissatisfaction grew. The question now was no longer if Solomon's reign would face consequences, but when. And so the whispers of discontent turned into a full-blown crisis. The golden age of Solomon was coming to an end, and Israel stood at a crossroads. Would the kingdom correct its course, or was it already too late? The answer would come in the form of the decline of a king who had everything, but lost the one thing that mattered most. The man who was once known as the wisest ruler in history now watched as his kingdom began to fall apart. The grandeur of Solomon's temple, once a symbol of his divine favor, was no longer enough to conceal the cracks spreading throughout his empire. The people's resentment had reached a boiling point. Taxes had become unbearable, as the costs of maintaining the palace, the massive harem, the foreign temples, and the military defenses drained the royal treasury. Solomon, who was once seen as a blessed leader, was now viewed by many as a king who had lost his way, but the weight of gold and power was not the only problem. The harem, which had once been a strategic tool for political alliances, had now become a source of division and religious corruption. Solomon's foreign wives, once symbols of diplomacy, now wielded great influence over policy and spirituality. The same alliances that once protected the kingdom were now tearing it apart. Priests of foreign gods held positions of power, and Israel's spiritual identity was in jeopardy. The very people who had once revered their king now whispered doubts about his devotion to God. Then came the political consequences. Internal revolts began to emerge among the tribes of Israel. The burden of heavy taxation, forced labor, and declining faith made many question their loyalty to Solomon. The elders of Israel, remembering the reign of King David, asked themselves, how did the son of a warrior king become so entangled in wealth, women, and foreign beliefs? How did the wisest man in history allow himself to be swayed by distractions? And soon Solomon began to lose his grip. The peace that had once defined his reign faded, replaced by constant tension. Small rebellions broke out in vassal states, and once loyal rulers began challenging Solomon's authority. His military strength was no longer what it once was. The kingdom, which once stood strong and united, now trembled under the weight of political, economic, and spiritual instability. But perhaps the greatest loss was internal. Solomon, who once walked in the presence of God, now found himself distant from the divine wisdom that had set him apart. God, who had personally appeared to Solomon twice, now spoke to him once more, but this time with a warning. The Lord declared that because Solomon had turned away, his kingdom would be divided after his death. His son would not inherit the full power of his father. The great nation that Solomon built would be torn apart. And so, the king who had once been revered and admired now carried the weight of his own downfall. His riches, wisdom, and alliances had once made him the most powerful ruler in the world, but now they were the very things that led to his collapse. And yet, one mystery remained: the legend of Solomon's ring. A ring that, according to tradition, gave him control over spirits and demons. Had it been his greatest tool, or had it become his greatest curse? As Solomon's final years unfolded, One question lingered. Was his ring still in his possession, or had it been taken from him? And if it was gone, was its power lost forever, or merely waiting to be found once again? And so, the king who had once been revered and admired now carried the weight of his own downfall. His riches, wisdom, and alliances had once made him the most powerful ruler in the world, but now they were the very things that led to his collapse. And yet one mystery remained, the legend of Solomon's ring. A ring that, according to tradition, gave him control over spirits and demons. Had it been his greatest tool, or had it become his greatest curse? As Solomon's final years unfolded, one question lingered. Was his ring still in his possession, or had it been taken from him? And if it was gone, was its power lost forever, or merely waiting to be found once again? Among the many mysteries surrounding Solomon's life, none are as fascinating as the legend of his magical ring. It was said that this ring, engraved with the sacred name of God, gave Solomon dominion over spirits and supernatural forces. Some believed that this ring enabled him to command demons, forcing them to complete impossible tasks. It was even rumored that Solomon used the power of the ring to build the temple itself, ordering unseen forces to move stones and refine gold with inhuman precision. But was this ring a divine gift or proof of Solomon's downfall? For most of his reign, Solomon wore the ring as a symbol of wisdom and authority. He judged disputes with supernatural insight, ruled with unmatched intelligence, and governed with an almost otherworldly sense of justice. But as his hunger for knowledge and power grew, whispers began to circulate. Had Solomon begun to use the ring for purposes beyond God's intention? And in the final years of his reign, something changed. According to some traditions, Solomon lost his ring, either by theft or because God himself took it away. Without it, his authority began to crumble rapidly. The king who once controlled everything was now struggling to control even his own fate. Without his ring, without divine favor, and with the divided kingdom looming, Solomon's fate was sealed. And as the king's final days came to an end, one mystery remained. What happened to the ring? Now that you've seen the true story behind Solomon's life, ask yourself, what really led the wisest king in history to ruin? Was it power, wealth, his 1,000 wives? Or was it the deadly combination of all these things? The reality is that Solomon started his reign with a heart fully devoted to God, but he ended up torn between political ambitions, foreign influences, and worldly temptations. His legacy still amazes the world today, but his downfall serves as a warning. No amount of riches or wisdom can hold a kingdom together if the leader's heart is divided. Now let me ask you, how many times have you seen brilliant people fall because they lost focus? How many started with purpose and discipline but were later distracted by the comforts of success and ended up far from where they were meant to be? This isn't just a story about an ancient king, it's a lesson for all of us. What are the riches and alliances in your life that might be pulling you away from your true purpose? If even Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, could be led astray, what stops us from making the same mistakes? The point isn't just to learn about history, but to apply these lessons to our lives today. What decisions can you make right now to ensure you stay on the right path? Now I want to hear from you. Which part of Solomon's story shocked you the most? Did you ever imagine that his downfall began inside his own palace? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here we uncover hidden truths in the Bible that few people talk about.